So the idea here is baseball in Cuba and the concept of dreaming the nation into being. This is a really important aspect of what I was discussing in my previous two essays here, because realistically, what we're talking about is, let's see if I can describe it, the revolutionary period in Cuba between, let's say, right around 1850 to 1900. We can just mark it off as those 50 years. You have a nation whose formative consciousness has gone through several different stages, right? The time before colonization, you have the Spanish colonization of Cuba, and then you have this moment in Cuba's history where it's asserting itself in a radical independence movement, which involves um, Cuban natives, even some Spanish colonists, right? You have this whole kind of revolutionary milieu which is springing up in response to the Spanish colonial rule, which is the assertion of Cuban national independence. Um, this assertion is an identity assertion of self, and it's coming at a really critical time in history in terms of the onset of modernity as a concept and a construct. Um, I would almost say one of the easiest ways to define modernity is to look at the writings of Nietzsche and the concept that God is dead and we have killed him. It is this idea that you're moving into a world which the existentialists articulate in the towards the middle of the 20th century, existentialist philosophers, that um, has lost its center of values, the cultural center of values that previously existed and held the stable traditional ground that held localities in place, right? Localities as cultures or regions that are have specific civilizational constructs attached to them, whether that's I don't know, United States or Rome or Cuba, right? You could name any place as a locus of identity that's unraveling. Um, and the reason why Nietzsche says this toward the end of the 1800s is because of the rapid onset of industrialization and globalization as realities, right? These are political realities that are onset even towards the end of the 1800s and only continue to escalate into the 1900s and just really break open in a major way with World War One. So what we're talking about here is cultural national identity, civic identity as a collective consciousness, and how that's being disrupted by a breaking foundationally of borders. Um, it's actually really interesting. There might not be anything that sums this up more accurately and more clearly than the use of baseball as a national foundation and an identity construct in Cuba, right? Because what this means is that baseball was formed and founded in the United States and becomes known as its sole mythic pastime and cultural output, right? Um, but beyond that, you have Cuba. Cuba takes baseball into its own hands, right? I talked about Nemesio Romaguera, um, really in the middle of the Civil War, right? He comes to the American South to go to school and literally takes baseball back with him. I think he brought a bat and a ball with him back to Cuba, and he teaches baseball to Cuba, right? And so it becomes this really interesting example of a export of a cultural heritage, baseball, which is usually and always tied to the United States. It has been exported to Cuba, and in doing so, actually, Cuba takes the sport and takes it further than the United States could have ever even dreamed possible, at least until the late 20th century, right? So what does this say about the revolutionary potentials in Cuba at this time? A lot of the ways to sum up modernity and globalization is actually through the lens of colony and colonization. And what I mean by that is that there is a long and storied history of global conquest, which historically, right up until the 20th century, really signified any sort of uh, real global expansion or contraction of narratives. So you have the Romans who expand across the Eastern Hemisphere, right? You have uh, the colonization of the United States of America or the colonization of Cuba by Spain, right? There are these instances of world exploration, right? Genghis Khan, another good example. These instances of world exploration, which are almost inevitably and irrevocably tied to the colonization of territories and indigenous peoples, right? This is a long and storied heritage. The Greeks, Persia, etc. Um, but what you have going into the 20th century that's so significant, and again why Cuba is such an important part of this and why baseball is such an important part of this, is you have a massive radical shift in national cultural identity coinciding with the global onset of modernity, as in industrialization, as in the entire world becomes a sort of open, contested space all at once with the onset of World War One, and this has to do with new forms of transportation, planes, cars, more efficient forms of transportation with boats, um, and this in turn, right? This global movement is a global movement not only of people but of information and of goods and services, right? And obviously cultural exports such as baseball. Um, when you have Cuba takes baseball and translates it, right? Cuba takes baseball and translates it through its its position, its moment in time, which is suspended between a colonial regime of traditional Spanish values, which are being superimposed and overlaid upon a native Cuban population, and the rapidly emerging national dissent, which is the attempt to formulate a collective cultural identity construct that will overthrow this assertion of traditional Spanish values on this colony, right? For the benefit of the empire and kingship of Spain. Um, and baseball becomes actually a revolutionary method of that kind of identity assertion. Um, it's well documented how popular the sport of baseball is and has been in Cuba since its growth in the late 1800s all the way up until and through the 1900s to this day. Um, it's waxed and waned several different times, but you have one of the primary baseball loving nations in that area and region, right? And baseball ends up spreading from Cuba to Puerto Rico. Right? There's a lot of cultural transmission that goes on here. You have one of the really earliest kind of founding fathers of baseball closer to the hemisphere, or closer to the equator. So, kind of what I want to examine here in terms of Cuba and dreaming the nation into being is how baseball specifically functioned as the transmission device, or in a large part of what allowed for and created, I think, a, a, a method of dissent in the Spanish colonial regime. I talked previously about the documents from Enrique Melendez working with the Spanish colonial government to certify and legalize these public events between the massive baseball teams at the time, including Havana. What's pictured here is a kind of composite, celebratory, commemorative document slash photo of the Havana baseball team in its championship 1886-1887 season. And if you can see, the furthest to the left who is standing is Saborit, and we discussed him as a dual figure, both Cuban revolutionary, right, for the independence movement, and Hall of Fame infielder, second baseman for the Havana team. Also, actually helped found the Havana baseball team. I think, in the 1870s. So this assertion of national identity, it really does run a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, through Sabourin, as well as through obviously the founder of baseball, Romaguera. But specifically in terms of this revolutionary moment, Sabourin, I think, is the best example of, you have this figure who is in large part enabling and constructing in real time the cultural function of baseball in Cuba. He's an instrumental figure in founding the Habana team, which is the most dominant team of the period going into the 1900s, the most foundational. And additionally, he is a Cuban revolutionary figure who is now and still currently revered for his the things that he did in that revolutionary movement against Spain. So there's this, it's like a slight pivot here. There's this method through which a collective, especially a national or regional collective, constructs its identity, right? There are the laws, the sort of rules and regulation of the polis at large. You have the cultural phenomena which people gather around, whether that's theater or sport. This is very well documented in Greek philosophical texts, right? Specifically Plato will talk about this in terms of wrestling and the Olympic Games, and the idea of the cultural construct of a national or civilizational identity. And what you get with the emergence of modernity and globalization, I think, which is really notable, and it's very different from the historical manifestations of cross-pollination of ideas, whether that's Alexandria in Egypt or Greece or Mongolia, what have you. This exchange of information, you could say the Silk Road as well, is that with the onset of a truly global world through industrialization, right, which is kind of the opening of borders, the opening of spaces, and the opening of territories simultaneously through technology, through kind of portability, right, movement, the ability to move people, the ability to move goods, services, information, which only rapidly scales with information technology, right? You have this opening of a total contestation of time and space, right, or place, so to speak. The national identity, which is like very briefly constructed toward the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s, is rapidly torn apart. The national identity is in large part constructed in terms of contested political borders through war. But it's the brief life of the nation is rapidly torn apart by industrialization of information and information technologies, whether that's physical transport or digital transport. So you're in a sort of crisis of identity, to bring this back to Nietzsche, a crisis of identity that begins in the latter half of the 19th century and just rapidly scales all through the 20th century into the 21st, which is nothing more than like a metaphysical existential crisis of the species, right? Because for so long, historically, you have these pockets of civilizational cultural context, and these pockets are the things that determine the borders and bounds of life. What is true, what is false, what is myth, what is heritage, right? All of these questions that come down to things like racial and ethnic identity, that come down to cultural identity. These are the things that traditionally have moored the human species in a sense of comfort or comfortability, a sense of stability or normalcy, right? You have this identity construct that's solidified. There are these expected things and behaviors that are to happen, and these things happen within the regional or local cultural context, because that's the way that the pocket of place and time functions. That's radically disrupted. Things speed up by the nature of industrialization and technologization, as well as places open up, right? So you have this dual factor. And accordingly, you have this cross-cultural transmission that's happening really all at once, very quickly. That's unprecedented. So obviously, baseball goes everywhere from Cuba to Japan. I mean, you name it, right? This is the United States cultural export at large. Hollywood obviously becomes a huge part of that. But you're looking at this period of time. I mean, there's no moving pictures. There's barely even photography. And really, at first, baseball is there, right, in the early 1800s. And Cuba picks up on this rapidly due to Romaguera's time that he spent in the American South during the Civil War at school. This moment of Cuban liberation is, interestingly, right, perhaps predictably, but interestingly, happening right at this crux moment of rapid onset globalization. This contested narrative of what constitutes the Cuban collective or national cultural consciousness is the territory that is being fought, ceded, fought, and won ultimately in the Spanish-American War and the Declaration of Cuban Sovereignty in 1900. This struggle is a great way to envision what is going on around the world at this time, because it's a very extreme, high contrast example of the struggle to create a collective mythic cultural consciousness that functions. Obviously, you see post this Cuban Revolution these struggles to actually assert and establish national sovereignty when the very infrastructure of the Spanish colonial regime is torn down, as well as the attempted export and removal of the values that the Spanish colonial regime was asserting in Cuba. And really one of the biggest successes that you see in Cuba post-revolution is through baseball. They take baseball and apply these radical political values to it and open up the necessary space to create some of the best baseball teams that ever existed. As in the Santa Clara Leopardos, which had everyone, I think, from Oscar Charleston to Jose Mendez. This you could say that team was one of the best, if not the best, baseball teams ever created, and it was created specifically through this radically permissive, desegregated, multicultural institution of baseball in Cuba, which included Black American players. This cultural permissiveness cannot be separated from the sort of dual function of what is happening there, which is the radical declaration of independence that is Cuba at this period of time, which is both a national and racial liberation. But additionally, through, let's see how I want to put this, through the intersecting force of globalization that is occurring at that time. So Cuba is attempting to assert its national identity and dream this national identity into being during a period of radical global instability, wherein the nation is a very temporary construct, because what the nation really is, at the end of the day, is just a modernization of these regional or local pockets, which were formerly called civilizations. Even then, that's kind of disputed jurisdiction and territory, right? There's these asserted identities that spring up from supposed researchers in academic settings and so forth. You have the Mayans or the Aztecs, but really what these kind of are is these are disparate pockets and communities that adhere somewhat closely to something that you could call or resemble a common cultural construct. And so you have this very local, tribal, institutional, in the sense that it's very tightly communal way of living that defines all really of early human civilization and history, with the exception of course, the empires like Mongolia or Rome or Persia. These attempts to conquer large regions and portions of the globe and institute something resembling a common code, a common law and a common cultural framework through which information, goods, and services and so forth can be transmitted through that larger civilizational construct. This fracture that is occurring, the fracture of modernity, again, to evoke Nietzsche, I just want to make sure we're keeping that in mind here. This fracture is occurring simultaneous to Cuba throwing off this colonial fetter and attempting to declare its collective cultural identity. And then as you see, and I think this is kind of the primary difference between the U.S. and Cuba, and a lot of the reasons why you see what happens after this independence movement in Cuba. The United States sets this framework and foundation earlier, right? We're talking about the mid 1700s into the late 1700s. The United States national identity becomes established, and it's becoming established under the old dominant order. They're taking the British colonial missives and taking them into their own hands, so to speak, and running with those in a world globally which is still primarily regional, right? Especially with the United States, you're dealing with a relatively isolated territory, right? Continental territory. Obviously, Canada, Mexico, and further down to the south with Cuba and South America. You are still dealing with a world that is largely, if not entirely, pre-modern, right? There's not the amount of technological resources, there's not the amount of infrastructural access, which allows for highly contested space and territory, which is really the definition of modernity. The information age has not yet hit the continental United States, and because of that, you have a colonial project which is it's almost isolated. And so you kind of flash forward 100 years and change to the Cuban revolutionary movement. We're in a radically different frame, in a radically different zone, where the inevitability and speed at which technologies are being produced, including the light bulb, right? All of these innovations that change the common or considered framework of reality through technology, right? Technology is the bridge to a radical new reality. We could talk about this in terms of AI just as much as the portable phone or the car or the computer, the light bulb, the plane, you name it, right? These are things that actually reorient the entire species, and we have to reconstruct an identity at a collective communal species level, right? That's something that's occurring alongside the Cuban attempt to construct a national identity. So the national and global borders are being broken apart by this onset information age. And so you see this really interesting attempted construct, actually in large part through the lens of an inherited or exported cultural device, baseball. It's a fascinating thing. And through this lens, which I think is detailed very thoroughly in the other essay portions, is that you can see a lot of the fraughtness of the time at a human level through these innovations which collapse social, collective, cultural identities and narratives, as well as personal. You can see the fraughtness through the lens of the radical nature and state of Cuban baseball as a reflection of the cultural collective crisis that was occurring at the time in Cuba. Because you have the attempt to establish a national identity in a world in which nations will no longer exist. And with the onset of World War I think with any amount of prescience, that's something that becomes very fundamentally clear. It's that when you live now in a globe which is fundamentally connected, even through war or disputed territories, in a way that it's not connected by landmass, right? It's connected by information, right? Or connected by colonial control methods that have rapidly escalated into world wars, for lack of a better word. Um, you no longer have the possibility of a local, collective, regional identity which exists in isolation from anything. So you have the death of the nation, as well as the death of everything that existed prior to human history. You have this age of empires, right? This age of uh, tribes or localities, which are civilizational constructs. That is happening at the same time. That age is dying, and it's being replaced with a truly global collective mythic identity, which is in formation, right? Still in the 20th century, that's something that's in form, or 21st century, that's something that's in formation. And baseball actually is a fantastic example of what is to come and what is occurring, right? Because again, you look here at Cuba as adopting this cultural framework, right? The export of the United States as America's pastime, adopting it as a essential foundational part of its mythic national construct, its identity, right? The way that Cuba conceives of itself, right, as a baseball loving nation. Um, you also have this with Japan, which is also really interesting, right? There's a long and storied history of U.S. and Japan relations through baseball, which are also very interestingly disrupted in World War II. People like Lefty O'Doul and even Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, who played these barnstorming games in Japan, there was a large amount of space that was opened up through this cultural transmission. And really, what we're looking at in modernity is that all of the cultural borders have opened up, and this information and these things that previously defined nations, civilizations, and small tribal pockets are now part of the collective stream of consciousness. And so, what's happening is you have these pockets which have actually really been destroyed because of that. The previously existing information that existed maybe in a small tribe that was located in a I don't know, in a borderland in the United States, or prior to the United States, right, in the early Americas. Um, you now have cell phones, computers, all of these different ways in which you're accessing information which will almost immediately dispute the claims made in any sort of civilizational or cultural context. So you're thrown from this pre-modern identity construct, which is the collective cultural myth, whether that's again, right, as I said, Quetzalcoatl, or whatever sort of mythic religious underpinning that you have that connects your society or your culture specifically, even something like through race or through ethnicity, right, through common bond of blood or heritage or what have you. You have this emergence of radical individuality, which is that this terrain is being immediately disputed constantly through the information age, and that only accelerates, right, through World War I into World War II, the television, the computer, right? These are all ways of accessing independent information, which puts the foundational civilizational or cultural questions into question. So you see that kind of change occur, and Cuba's exists in this very transitional moment of the attempt to establish that, even as that entire institution or political possibility at the level of humankind is falling apart. And they take baseball, right? They take this American export of baseball, and they turn it into something that America could not have dreamed to be possible within their civilizational empire concept, right? Because they create this radical inclusion, which is part and parcel the spirit of revolution in Cuba, which was both racial and economic and national, cultural. They imbue it with that, as well as the global countercurrent of consciousness, of the collective consciousness, which is this awareness, which is being articulated a little early by Nietzsche, that all of these institutions, these cultural collective institutions, are crumbling because of this coming wave of modernity, globalization, and industrialization. So this is happening in a very fraught time, in a very fraught period of human consciousness. And from it emerges something that almost seems like it should have occurred 50 or even 100 years later. precisely because of this radical window of hyperspace where so many things are possible because so many things are changing and falling apart, um, including basic common concepts of culture and identity. Um, so this is a great window because I think you look at this then and that you look at this period now in the early approaching mid 21st century, and you look at that and you say there's a extreme overhaul in identity being caused by technology. This is something that's common to us, and I think it is relatable because you're having a more and more sort of pinpoint locust, so to speak, LOCUSED, uh, identity construct, which is becoming less and less collective and more personal, and yet more and more globally collective because the technology is the window through which identity is being formulated. Um, you no longer have these cultural, collective, civilizational constructs of meaning, which are mutually abided as a sort of law or reason or rule, um, precisely because this window has been opened, a technological window through which identity can be commonly individually asserted. Um, and this has to do with the availability of information because you live in a tribal or regional construct. You're looking at the common myths, the common knowledges, the common space and territory, which has been clearly defined as what is true or what is possible or what is real. You open up that space and you break that space with a global information technology, and you enter into a space which is radically undefined, unstable, and without foundation, without true foundation. And that space immediately becomes open to individual interpretation. You're no longer living in that mythic zone of collective cultural identity, which in a lot of ways is a sort of form of safety because it's a reification of what we collectively perceive to be true or collectively perceive to be real. And you break that mythic spell by a radical assertion of modernity, which is a radical assertion of context. Things become global. Information breaks up the territory of what constitutes Japanese identity or American identity. And you have a total collapse and meltdown of those cultural constructs. It's a context which once existed but ceases to exist because of technological advancement. Science works much in the same way. You have a scientific revelation which is backed by empirical information, and all of a sudden the world that appeared to exist before, whether it's like a classical Newtonian world or a quantum mechanical world, ceases to exist, and it's replaced with a new framework which is more informed. Um, and through that, right, you have this constant human attempt to establish a context or establish a framework through which life can be reasonably lived. So I brought up the existentialist philosophers in the mid 20th century. What they're responding to, this idea of a radically free human being which needs to decide or chooses to decide which way to live. A lot of that's from the Sartre, right? That they're reflecting on this. They're reflecting on what's happening in Cuba, which is happening globally. But Cuba is just very, very, very high contrast because their liberation project, right? Again, a racial and a national liberation project is occurring at and through the same time that this collective species level human re-identification is being forced to occur through technology, through portability of information, through movement, physical movement, right, which is made possible by technology like cars and the rapid innovation of planes, right? Um, this contextual cultural overhaul opens space, right? It doesn't close space, it opens space. It makes things more possible. And in making things more possible, you have a radical destabilization of the former, which is now conservative, right? It used to be contemporary, but it becomes conservative approach of this is all that's possible. We know this, so this is our established identity. And when that breaks, when that appearance breaks, and you're thrust into a radical new world with radically new precepts and possibilities, the resistance is strong because that's a habituated identity construct. It's literally programmed into the neurology, right? The neural patterns of the human being and all of the collective that are constituted under this pattern of existence. It's the everyday, so to speak, as Mayakovsky would call it, the Russian poet. So, like in Russia, in the 1910s, you have this radical independence movement, which is a response to this crazy global flux of identity and change. Right. This is World War One. This is also happening in many ways in America. These previously established, right, hundreds and hundreds of years, cultures are being forced into a confrontation with identity. Right. The czarist regime. Again, the radical Russian movement, the Red Revolution. This is a response to a very, very old traditional cultural construct, which has been retrofitted to a radically new modern reality of global transmission of information, which and resources, which it just no longer fits. It's no longer politically possible. At one point, it was, and maybe it was the best method, maybe it was the worst. It doesn't matter. But at one point, it was because of the world that was possible at the time, because of the technological infrastructural possibilities of that world vision. Right, it was just what was humanly possible. But you add in this form of immense cultural power, which is like a bullet train. I think is a great example. You add a bullet train into the mix of a pre-modern civilization, and their values have to be radically transvaluated. Right, that's another kind of Nietzschean term. It's the values have to be entirely overhauled at the root and the foundation to be modern. You have to become contemporary, and you don't become contemporary through remaining or retaining the old cultural constructs. You become contemporary by creating new cultural constructs in response to this progressive opening of the terrain. So I think that's a pretty good foundation here for this. The Cuban baseball is just a great window into this process and how it functions and how it works. Because what you're witnessing here with Cuban baseball in real time is really maybe even one of the earliest examples of modernity, maybe the earliest example of modernity itself, because this is happening in 1850, in 1860. This is happening at the really what I would describe as the very beginning of this period. And so you have the French poet Baudelaire who writes about this. Walter Benjamin writes about this. Obviously, Nietzsche writes about this. These are kind of the prophets of modernity, so to speak. They're witnessing this and experiencing this in Europe, right, in real time as it's happening. I mean, Europe is a pretty small space of regional pockets, right? This is an opening up terrain, which you have the European Union coming into the 21st century, and these kinds of ideas that held and hold very strong, but you see them breaking and fracturing under this immense weight of the rapid scaling of modernity. I mean, right, this happens in Cuba in the 1850s and 1860s. I mean, baseball is culturally exported across borders. It becomes a huge part of the national identity of Cuba and plays a role, which you could debate how significant, but I would argue pretty significant, in the establishment of the Cuban cultural national identity in the midst of the Spanish colonial regime, and through figures like Saborin, right, who serves a dual function in this culture as a foundational baseball figure as well as a foundational revolutionary figure. You can see that baseball was on the forefront of this radical revolutionary method being applied in Cuba, which was the assertion of a collective cultural identity, breaking down the former Spanish empirical method of colonial dominion, breaking that down. As I was saying, a lot like in Russia, you have Mayakovsky and the Russian poets as this kind of radical avant-garde, breaking down the presumed boundaries, Trotsky, Lenin, breaking down the presumed boundaries of the Tsarist regime, to bring into being a radical new Russia, or attempt to, right? I think with Russia as with Cuba, you can see that the fallout of these events was perhaps not as they intended or wished by any means. Attempt to bring in a radically new vision of Cuba, of Russia, of America, what have you, which can actually exist and correspond with the real political circumstances of the world at the time, right? the demands of modernity must be met with a radically new cultural valuation, a radically new cultural system. And that's what these revolutionary movements at the deepest foundational level are and represent. That these methods, which may have been the best possible, who knows? I mean, probably not, right? These methods, they're no longer viable by any means, right? The information is too open. The borders are too open. There's no way to contain within a pocket this cultural narrative or identity construct. It's being broken open by global modernity. So that's the video there. I hope you like this one, and I will see you on the next one.